Since February 19, 1945, the black sand of Iwo Jima burned under the morning sun as waves of U.S. Marines stormed ashore. The island was small, barely 8 square miles, but it was one of the most heavily fortified places on Earth. Japanese forces had spent months digging a network of bunkers, tunnels, and pillboxes beneath the volcanic rock. To them, this was sacred ground, a final shield before the homeland. Captain Hayashi, commander of a Japanese bunker on the northern slope of Mount Suribachi, peered through his rangefinder as American landing crafts swarmed the beaches. "Hold your fire," he ordered. His men waited silently, faces streaked with soot, rifles ready. They had faced countless American attacks before. Artillery, tanks, bombers, but nothing could prepare them for what was coming next. The first American tanks rolled out from the landing ships. Shermans, familiar shapes to Hayashi's men. But something about them was different. On their turrets were strange, snout-like tubes instead of cannons. The Japanese soldiers whispered nervously. "Flamethrowers," one muttered, voice trembling. Hayashi dismissed it at first. "Impossible. They can't carry enough fuel for that." But when the first tank fired, the truth roared across the battlefield. A jet of fire, nearly 100 feet long, burst from the tank's nozzle, a river of flame that engulfed the nearest pillbox in seconds. The air shimmered with heat. The screams of the trapped soldiers echoed through the tunnels. Hayashi froze. He had seen grenades, shells, even napalm, but never fire like this. Fire that moved like a living creature, hunting every shadow. The American tanks advanced methodically, one by one, using bursts of flame to clear every bunker. Japanese machine guns rattled desperately, but bullets bounced harmlessly off the Sherman's armor. Inside one bunker, Sergeant Kuroda grabbed his Nambu pistol and shouted for his men to hold their ground. "For the Emperor!" he cried. But then came the hiss, that awful hiss, followed by a roar of flame pouring through the firing slit. The entire room vanished in fire. Hayashi ran deeper into the tunnels, choking on smoke. The oxygen was vanishing fast. Above, the ceiling shook as tanks rolled overhead, spraying liquid fire into every crevice. The walls turned orange with heat. Men were burning alive in chambers they had dug with their own hands. One soldier screamed, clawing at the earth as his uniform ignited. On the surface, American Marines watched silently as the tanks did their grim work. Even they were shocked by the destruction. The flame tanks, nicknamed Satan and Zippo, were designed specifically for Iwo Jima's tunnels. Their job was to burn the enemy out of hiding. One Marine whispered, "This is hell on earth." By sunset, Mount Suribachi was cloaked in smoke. The Japanese defenders who survived were ghosts, blackened, coughing, and broken. Hayashi crawled to the edge of a crater and looked down at the beach, now filled with American flags and vehicles. He could barely understand what he had witnessed. This is not war," he murmured weakly. "This is something else." He collapsed as another wave of fire rolled across the ridge, turning night into day. For the Japanese soldiers who fought there, Iwo Jima would forever be remembered not for their bravery, but for the fire America unleashed from its iron beasts. The island was now a furnace. For 4 days straight, the battle had turned into something beyond imagination. The black volcanic ash swallowed boots, burned hands, and filled lungs. The air stank of cordite and fire. The Japanese defenders, once confident in their tunnels, now fought for every breath as the American flamethrower tanks rolled closer each hour. Captain Hayashi's bunker had survived 3 assaults. The 4th would not be the same. Through a small periscope slit, he saw the strange American tanks approaching again. Their turrets moved like serpents, spraying fire that crawled along the trenches and through cracks in the ground. The flames weren't just destroying men, they were erasing the very earth itself. "Commander!" shouted Private Tanaka, his face covered in soot. They're burning the tunnels ahead. Hayashi nodded grimly. Then we fight underground. In the twisting tunnels below, the soldiers prepared their last defense. They stacked crates of grenades, loaded Arisaka rifles, and prayed. Some sang quietly, others wept silently in the dark. Hayashi walked through them, his uniform scorched and torn, his sword blackened by smoke. "We were born on this island," he said softly. "We will die on it too." Above them, the ground shook. The Americans were sealing tunnels with explosives and fire. One explosion ripped through the ceiling, sending a rain of molten ash into the chamber. The temperature soared. The light dimmed to a red haze. Then came the hissing roar. The unmistakable sound of another flame burst pouring through the cracks. Tanaka screamed, firing his rifle blindly toward the light. Flames shot past him like liquid wind, clinging to his uniform. The bunker turned into an inferno. Hayashi dragged him out, his own arms blistering. He stumbled toward the deeper tunnels, coughing blood and smoke. Meanwhile, on the surface, U.S. Marines watched from behind their tanks. Sergeant O'Connor climbed onto his Sherman, his eyes wide at the devastation below. "Jesus," he muttered, "they just keep coming." Beside him, another Marine replied, "They won't surrender. We burn, they dig. We dig, they burn. This rock's alive." Every yard of Iwo Jima was paid for with blood. Marines used bulldozers to push wrecked tanks aside and clear paths for the next assault. Corpsmen dragged the wounded through burning craters. The beach that once looked endless now looked like the moon, black, broken, and silent, except for the distant rumble of tanks. Back below, Hayashi reached what was left of the command tunnel. Only a handful of men remained. The radio had melted. The maps were ashes. The last message from Tokyo had come 2 days earlier. "Hold to the last man." He looked at the faces around him, tired, starving, terrified. "We have done our duty," he said hoarsely. "Now, we join our ancestors." A rumble above cut his words short. The roof collapsed. Dust rained down, and then came the final blow. A direct hit from a flamethrower tank. The tunnel filled with blinding light as fire surged in, consuming everything. Outside, a column of thick, greasy smoke rose into the sky. Marines watched it for a long moment in silence. "That's one more bunker down," someone said quietly. But even they couldn't shake the feeling that something sacred had been destroyed. By nightfall, Mount Suribachi's slopes glowed red under the flames. The Japanese forces were no longer fighting in organized units. They were ghosts in the dark, emerging from holes only to vanish again in smoke and fire. As Hayashi's bunker burned, his final thought was not of defeat, but disbelief. The Americans had turned the island into a weapon, a place where the earth itself seemed to breathe fire. The volcano rumbled through the night, as if the island itself mourned. Smoke curled across the battlefield, wrapping the broken land in a ghostly shroud. American Marines moved cautiously between the blackened craters, their boots sinking into ash that still glowed faintly from hidden fires. Beneath them, deep in the tunnels, the last of Japan's defenders prepared to strike back. Captain Hayashi lay half-conscious in the darkness, his ears ringing, uniform burned and torn. Somehow, he had survived the inferno. Around him were only 3 men, Private Tanaka, Corporal Ito, and Sergeant Mori. Their eyes gleamed like dying coals in the flickering light of a shattered lantern. "They think we're all dead," Hayashi whispered, coughing smoke. "Let's show them we're not." They crawled through the tunnels, narrow, choking, half-collapsed, to reach an exit shaft overlooking the beach. The sound of engines above told them the Americans were bringing in more tanks and supplies. The island was slipping away, but Hayashi refused to die quietly. "Prepare the grenades," he ordered. "Tonight, we attack from beneath the ground." At dusk, while Marines gathered for rations near their tanks, the earth suddenly exploded behind them. A hidden tunnel burst open, and Japanese soldiers poured out, dirty, burned, but fierce. They threw grenades, screaming, "Banzai!" as they charged through the smoke. It was madness, suicidal, desperate, and terrifying. One Marine turned too late. A bayonet flashed, cutting through his rifle strap. O'Connor and his squad fired back, tracers streaking the twilight. The air filled with dust, screams, and the metallic ring of steel on steel. The battle was no longer about strategy. It was raw survival. O'Connor ducked behind a wrecked Sherman, reloading. "They came out of the ground!" he shouted. "They're under us! Flamethrowers, get up here!" someone yelled. A Marine with a portable flamethrower stepped forward, tank hissing on his back. He pressed the trigger, and once again, the night turned to fire. Flames rolled through the tunnels, washing over the attackers. The ground shook with the heat. Within seconds, the Banzai charge became a funeral pyre. Hayashi and his men were thrown backward by the blast. His face was burned, his uniform in tatters. He could barely see through the smoke. Around him, his soldiers lay silent, their weapons melted into the earth. Still, he crawled toward the surface, dragging himself up through the ash. When he emerged, he saw something that made him stop. Atop Mount Suribachi, silhouetted against the rising sun, an American flag fluttered in the wind. For a long moment, no one fired. Even the smoke seemed to pause. The battle still raged below, but that small piece of cloth meant everything. Tanaka, barely alive, whispered, "They've taken the mountain." Hayashi stared at the flag. "Then our duty is done," he said quietly. An artillery blast thundered nearby, and the two men disappeared in the cloud. Hours later, as Marines raised a second, larger flag for the photographers, the smell of burning tunnels still hung in the air. O'Connor looked toward the mountain, wiping sweat and ash from his face. "We took the island," he said, "but I'm not sure anyone really won." The wind howled across the black sands of Iwo Jima, carrying with it the echoes of both sides, cries, prayers, and the memory of fire. The Japanese forces had fought to the last man. The Americans had unleashed a power they themselves could barely comprehend. And beneath that smoking island, history had burned itself into the ground. The smoke still hadn't cleared. Even after days of fighting, the island breathed like a wounded beast, coughing fire, dust, and the smell of molten earth. The American flag fluttered over Mount Suribachi, but the battle for Iwo Jima was far from over. Beneath the mountain, hundreds of Japanese soldiers still hid in the labyrinth of tunnels, determined to die rather than surrender. Sergeant O'Connor led his squad cautiously along a ridge where the black sand met twisted metal. "Stay sharp," he warned, scanning the ground. "They're still down there." Every step could be over a hidden bunker or a tunnel entrance. Marines had learned the hard way. Silence here meant danger. As the Americans moved forward, they uncovered an opening carved into the rock, almost invisible from above. The stench of death and smoke poured out. O'Connor motioned for his men to stay low. "Flamethrower, up front!" Private Lewis stepped forward, his face ghostly behind the soot. The nozzle of his weapon gleamed like a serpent's head. He pressed the trigger. A jet of fire roared down the tunnel, lighting up the underground passage like day. Screams echoed back, mixed with the crackle of burning fuel. When the flames finally died, all that remained was silence and smoke. But this tunnel was different. It didn't end with a bunker. It kept going, deep into the mountain. O'Connor and his men descended cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the dark. What they found stunned them. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, a command post. Wooden tables, maps still pinned to the walls, rifles stacked neatly. A half-burned Japanese flag hung behind a makeshift altar. On the floor lay notebooks, letters, and diaries. Messages from soldiers who knew they would never leave the island. O'Connor knelt, picking up one of the notebooks. The handwriting was neat despite the soot. He couldn't read Japanese, but one line stood out, written in shaky English. "If we burn, Japan still stands." He stared at the words for a long time. In that moment, the enemy didn't feel like monsters, just men who had been trapped in hell. Farther inside the tunnel, they found something even stranger: a hidden hospital. The walls were lined with bunks. Bandaged soldiers lay motionless, their faces pale. Most were already dead, their wounds too severe. In one corner, a young Japanese medic sat slumped against the wall, his hands still gripping a blood-stained bandage roll. He hadn't fled. He had simply fallen asleep forever. O'Connor's men stood in silence. They were still treating the wounded down here, one Marine whispered. They never stopped. Back outside, the volcano rumbled again. Explosions shook the ground as other Marine units sealed the last tunnels. The battle had turned into a grim hunt, fire and steel against shadows and silence. Each new discovery revealed another pocket of resistance, another chamber of ghosts. As night fell, O'Connor sat on a crate near the beach, watching the flickering glow from the burning ridges. The sky was red, the sea black. He thought of the notebook in his pack, of the words that still haunted him. Lieutenant Harris approached, lighting a cigarette. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. "I have," O'Connor replied quietly. "About 1,000 of them." The lieutenant nodded, exhaling smoke into the wind. "We won, Sergeant." "That's what matters." O'Connor looked toward Mount Suribachi's silhouette. "Maybe," he said, "but some victories don't feel like victories." High above, the flag still waved, untouched by the fires below. The island that had once been a fortress was now a grave. Beneath it, in tunnels lit only by embers, the last defenders of Japan faded into silence. Men who refused to surrender. Men whose courage had turned the island into legend. The island was nearly conquered, yet it felt cursed. Every ridge hid a new horror, every tunnel another ambush. By now, American Marines had sealed hundreds of caves, destroyed dozens of bunkers, and burned entire hillsides, but the Japanese still fought from the shadows. They were ghosts now, silent, desperate, and fearless. Sergeant O'Connor and his men were assigned to clear the northern section of the island, known to the troops as the Maze. The tunnels here twisted in every direction, some so tight a man could barely crawl through. The air was hot and foul. "Feels like we're walking into the devil's lungs," muttered Private Lewis, gripping his rifle. "Keep your eyes open," O'Connor said quietly. "They're waiting for us down here." As they moved deeper, they found strange scenes: burned-out rooms with tea sets still on the floor, letters pinned to walls, and helmets placed neatly on folded uniforms. The Japanese hadn't fled, they had prepared for death. Some had even written their names on white cloths tied around their heads, so their families would know who had fallen. Suddenly, a faint clinking echoed ahead. O'Connor froze. Then, movement. A flash of light. Grenades rolled toward them. "Back! Back!" he shouted. The explosion ripped through the tunnel, sending dust and fire in every direction. Lewis fell, his arm torn open. The tunnel shook, and part of the ceiling collapsed. O'Connor dragged him out, coughing through the smoke. "They're right under us," he gasped. Up above, other Marine units were sealing tunnels with explosives, but some of the blasts were too weak. At night, Japanese soldiers would crawl out through hidden shafts and attack the Americans in their sleep. Bayonets glinted under the moonlight as desperate banzai charges struck the camps. Even wounded men rose from stretchers to fight one last time. On the night of March 3rd, the largest of these counterattacks came. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Nishi, burst from the northern tunnels. Many wore bandages and blood-soaked uniforms. Some had swords, others only grenades. Their battle cry rolled through the darkness. Tenno Heika Banzai! Long live the Emperor! The Marines were caught off guard. Flares lit up the night as machine guns opened fire. Tracers streaked across the black sand. The attackers came in waves, their silhouettes swallowed by fire and smoke. For 10 minutes, chaos ruled the island. Then the flamethrower tanks arrived. Shermans rolled forward, nozzles hissing. Fire erupted across the battlefield once more. Bright, roaring, unstoppable. The night turned orange. The screams of the dying faded into the crackle of burning oil. When dawn came, the ground was covered in silence. O'Connor stood among the ashes, his uniform torn, his face streaked with soot. He looked down at the body of a Japanese officer, burned, but still gripping his sword. In his pocket, O'Connor found a photo of the man's family, a wife and 2 children, smiling in front of a cherry tree. For a moment, the sergeant couldn't move. He turned toward the rising sun. "God help us all," he murmured. "There's no glory in this." By March 6th, organized resistance was gone. The last Japanese messages intercepted spoke of honor, fire, and the homeland. The Americans sealed the final tunnels with explosives, burying the defenders where they fought. When the rumbling ended, the island finally fell silent. But beneath the scorched surface of Iwo Jima, the echoes of those trapped souls lingered, in tunnels that would never see daylight again, in diaries that turned to ash, in letters never sent home. The Americans had taken Iwo Jima. Yet for many who survived, the victory felt hollow. They had witnessed not just courage, but the very edge of human endurance. The battle was over, but the island was still alive with ghosts. Smoke drifted from craters that never cooled. The sand reeked of oil, blood, and scorched metal. Marines walked through the ruins in silence, their rifles slung low, searching for what remained. The flag on Mount Suribachi fluttered gently in the wind, but down below the real work had just begun. Sergeant O'Connor moved through the battlefield with a small recovery team. Their mission was grim: clear the last tunnels, recover the dead, and find anything of intelligence value. He had survived the fire, the counterattacks, and the long nights of screams. But now, as he looked around the ruins, he felt something heavier than fear: sorrow. "Sir, you might want to see this," a Marine called from a collapsed tunnel. O'Connor walked over, stepping past charred helmets and burned rifles. The man pointed to a small alcove carved into the wall. Inside were the remains of 5 Japanese soldiers, sitting upright, backs against the rock. Between them lay a single lantern, still blackened from smoke. One held a diary, another clutched a photograph. O'Connor crouched down, brushing away the ash. The photograph showed 6 men in uniform, smiling before the battle. The same faces now sat in silence before him. He closed his eyes for a moment. "They didn't run," he whispered. "They just waited." The diary was passed to an interpreter. The words inside were written in neat, careful Japanese, and, at the end, a final line stood out: "If we must die, let the fire be our witness." Outside, trucks rumbled by, carrying the wounded to makeshift hospitals along the beach. Medics worked under torn canvas tents, stitching wounds that no medicine could truly heal. Some Marines sat quietly by the shore, staring at the horizon, their faces blank. They had seen things that would never leave them. That afternoon, O'Connor joined a group of men clearing another tunnel complex near the northern cliffs. Inside, they found crates of weapons, food, even medical supplies untouched. And on one wall, drawn in charcoal, was a map of Japan, surrounded by handprints. Dozens of them, the fingerprints of men who knew they'd never see home again. Private Lewis, his arm still bandaged, whispered, "They fought for every inch, and we burned it all." O'Connor nodded. And still, they didn't quit. Not until the fire took them. Later, as the sun dipped into the sea, the Marines gathered at the beach for a brief ceremony. A bugle played over the waves. They buried both Americans and Japanese side by side, marked only by small wooden crosses and rising smoke. The chaplain read softly, his voice trembling, "From the ashes of battle, may peace be born." O'Connor looked out toward Mount Suribachi one last time. The flag waved above the black rock, a symbol of victory, but also of loss. He remembered the burned tunnels, the letters, the family photos, the faces that had vanished in the flames. For the world, Iwo Jima would soon become a headline, a triumph, a photograph, a symbol of courage. But for those who walked its burning ground, it would forever remain a memory carved in fire. As the transport ships arrived to take the survivors away, O'Connor stood at the edge of the beach. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke and ocean salt. "We won," he said softly to no one. "But I left something here I'll never get back." Behind him, the volcano loomed in silence, a black monument to the cost of war. The island was quiet now, but the silence was unnatural, too heavy, too watchful. Every gust of wind carried the smell of fire and rust. The black sand was littered with helmets, twisted rifles, and wrecked tanks that shimmered faintly in the heat. The battle was over, but Iwo Jima still felt alive, like something beneath the ground refused to rest. American engineers had begun the grim task of reopening sealed tunnels. They needed to map the underground network, clear mines, and recover anything of intelligence value. Many of the tunnels had been blasted shut with flamethrowers or explosives, yet faint sounds sometimes echoed from the depths. Metal creaking, sand shifting, or what some Marines swore sounded like whispers. Sergeant O'Connor was ordered to accompany one of the engineering teams. "You've seen more of this place than anyone," the lieutenant told him. "You'll know what's down there." O'Connor hesitated. He had no desire to go underground again. The tunnels had already taken enough from him: friends, sleep, and peace of mind. But duty was duty. He loaded his carbine, checked his flashlight, and followed the engineers into the earth once more. The air inside was still thick with soot. The walls were black, the ground damp from condensation. As they went deeper, their boots echoed against the stone. They passed scorched bunkers, melted helmets, and skeletons half buried in ash. The deeper they went, the more it felt like walking into a tomb. "Sir," one engineer called, shining his light on the wall. Carved into the rock were hundreds of Japanese characters, prayers, oaths, and names. "These weren't just tunnels," O'Connor said quietly. "They were temples. Farther in, they entered what looked like a command chamber. Tables were overturned, and burned papers lay scattered across the floor. On one wall, written in bold black ink, were the words, 'The fire above will purify the warriors below.' Beside it hung a charred map of the island, marked with dozens of circles, defensive strongholds, each one now silent. Then, in the far corner, they found a small shrine, a wooden box still intact despite the heat. Inside were letters, wrapped carefully in cloth, and a small sword with an inscription. The translator read it aloud. "To die in fire is to rise in honor." It was signed by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander of Iwo Jima. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even O'Connor, hardened by weeks of horror, felt a chill crawl through him. He had heard stories about Kuribayashi, the general who refused to surrender, who commanded his men to fight to the last bullet, and who had vanished in the final days of the battle. Now, it seemed, they had found where he made his last stand. Near the shrine was a scorched journal, its pages mostly burned, but one sentence remained legible in English. "We have met a fire the gods themselves would fear." The team packed the artifacts carefully and made their way back to the surface. As they emerged into the daylight, the wind howled across the barren island. The volcano loomed behind them, silent, but still smoking. a black monument against the pale sky. That night, O'Connor couldn't sleep. He sat on the beach, staring at the waves. The journal's words replayed in his mind. He realized then that Iwo Jima wasn't just a battlefield. It was a graveyard for an entire generation of men, both American and Japanese. He thought about the flamethrower tanks, about the screams, about the tunnels still buried deep beneath his boots. For a moment, he imagined the island whispering, not with hate, but with memory. "Maybe they're still down there," Lewis said softly, joining him. O'Connor nodded. "Yeah, and maybe they're finally at peace." As dawn rose over the Pacific, the light touched the flag atop Mount Suribachi once more. The fire had gone out, but the story of Iwo Jima and the men who faced its flames would burn in history forever. The sea around Iwo Jima was calm now, eerily calm, as if the ocean itself wanted to forget what had happened. The waves rolled gently against the black volcanic shore that only weeks earlier had been alive with fire and fury. But for the men still stationed there, forgetting was impossible. Every gust of wind carried ash. Every rock and crater held a memory. By now, the first war correspondents and photographers had arrived on the island. They came to capture victory, to write stories of courage and triumph. But when their boots touched the charred earth, what they saw left them silent. The air smelled of oil and death. The ground was cracked and blistered. Nothing green grew. Sergeant O'Connor met one of them, a young reporter named Frank Mallory from Life magazine. He had a camera slung over his shoulder and a notebook in his hand. "They told me this place was important," Frank said quietly. "But they didn't tell me it was this." O'Connor gave a tired nod. "You can write about courage, son," he said, "but you'll never capture the sound of men burning." Frank didn't answer. He simply followed as O'Connor led him toward the tunnels that had been unearthed days earlier. Inside, Frank took photographs, melted helmets, broken rifles, letters fused by heat. His flashlight caught the reflection of a burned sword half buried in the dirt. On the hilt, Japanese characters shimmered faintly. "Honor in fire." "Who were they?" Frank asked softly. "Soldiers," O'Connor replied. "Just like us." Outside, Marines were building makeshift memorials. Small wooden crosses and steel helmets balanced on rifles. Some marked American graves, others Japanese. The line between enemy and brother had begun to blur. Everyone understood what it had cost to take this island. Later that evening, O'Connor sat with Frank near the beach as the sun sank behind Mount Suribachi. The volcano was just a black shadow now, silent, but watching. Frank opened his notebook. "I want people to know the truth," he said. "Not the glory, the truth." O'Connor stared at the horizon. "Then tell them what the fire looked like," he said. "Tell them how it crawled across the sand like a living thing. Tell them how the men screamed and how we couldn't stop it. Tell them that victory can smell like burning flesh." Frank swallowed hard, scribbling the words. "You think they'll print that?" O'Connor shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Someone needs to remember." In the following weeks, ships carried the wounded home. Others transported the dead, wrapped in canvas, tagged with numbers instead of names. Letters were sent to families across America and Japan alike, each one a piece of the island carried back to the living. When Frank's article was finally published, it shocked the world. His photographs of the tunnels, the burned weapons, and the haunting silence of Iwo Jima filled magazine pages from New York to Tokyo. Readers called it Hell on Earth. Some cried. Some turned the pages quickly, unable to look. But the truth was out. Iwo Jima had not been a simple victory. It was a warning about what humanity could become when the fire of war consumed everything. Months later, O'Connor was reassigned to Okinawa. As he left the island, he stood on the ship's deck and looked back one last time. Mount Suribachi faded into the mist. Goodbye, "Old ghost," he whispered. The black island slowly disappeared behind the waves, but in his mind, the fire still burned. Not in hatred, but in remembrance. For every man who fought there, Japanese or American, Iwo Jima had become something more than a battlefield. It was a grave, a lesson, and a scar carved into the soul of the Pacific.